This video is sponsored by Incogni. Stick around to find out more.
I can smile, and murder whilst I smile, and cry content to that which grieves my heart, and wet my cheeks with artificial tears, and frame my face to all occasions. I'll drown more sailors than the mermaid.
This is the classic image that we have of Richard III, sulking, cruel, desperate for revenge.
Can I do this, and cannot get a crown?
Laurence Olivier's 1955 interpretation of Shakespeare's Richard III galvanised that image. It's a portrayal that continues Shakespeare's two-dimensional view of Richard. Olivier's core theme is that evil is apparent, it's obvious, and can be driven out by the brave and the righteous.
Richard III has fascinated historians for centuries. He's been a bit of an obsession of mine for decades, and I know it's weird. Even though he only reigned for 2 years, to many people, he remains a cruel, manipulative, child-murdering tyrant.
You know the stories of the wicked uncle, but I want to discover what we really know about Richard III and see whether he deserves his bad reputation. Over 2 episodes, I'm going to explore his story in detail, from childhood to that long-lost grave forgotten in a Leicester car park. I'll be visiting the places that impacted Richard's life and meeting expert historians along the way to unravel the myths that surround him as I try to uncover who the real Richard was. Just like Richard III, people are trying to dig up your valuables, but now it's happening online with your data, not in car parks, but it is possible to get that data back. That's why we're excited to share the sponsor of this video, Incogni. Incogni is a powerful data removal service which wipes your personal info from the internet. It works non-stop, sending removal requests with the sole purpose of protecting you from identity theft. Right now, your digital drawbridge is down. Your enemy has full access to your data. The enemy in question is data brokers who procure and sell your personal information. Scammers can also access this data from data brokers, which puts you at risk of being scammed and will also affect your chances of getting loans. The more information there is about you online, the easier this is to do. Trying to do this yourself can drive you mad, so learn from King Richard's mistakes and let Incogni go into battle for you. Protect your privacy with confidence. If Incogni isn't right for you, get a full refund within 30 days, guaranteed. Take your personal data back with Incogni. Use code HISTORYHIT at the link below and get 60% off an annual plan, or visit incogni.com/historyhit. Richard would reign over England as King Richard III for 2 years. He died at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 and was the last Plantagenet king.
I'm a Ricardian, which probably comes as no surprise to you. I'm currently chair of the Richard III Society. For me, being a Ricardian means that I think Richard has been given a raw deal by history, that he wasn't Shakespeare's villain. But I want to try and explain to you why I think history has given Richard a rough deal. There's going to be plenty of alternative views along the way to keep me in check, though.
Now, one thing Richard is remembered for is his appearance. That haircut that has stuck as the haircut of villains for centuries, and those dark, piercing eyes, and of course the view from Shakespeare of him as that bunchback toad, based on his scoliosis, a curvature of the spine. Now, plenty of this isn't true. He may even have had blonde hair and blue eyes. Research undertaken by the University of Leicester shows the impact that this had on him physically would have been very slight, with no evidence he would have walked with any kind of limp, and he definitely didn't have a withered arm.
Things like this highlight Shakespeare's vision as demonstrably wrong in comparison to historical and biological evidence. But to explore this short-lived king's story fully, we need to head back to his very early days. Richard was born in 1452 in Fotheringay, Northamptonshire, in England. This was a time when the smouldering embers of unrest were threatening to burst into the flames of civil war. The conflict would become known as the Wars of the Roses between the houses of Lancaster and York. Richard's father, Richard, Duke of York, and mother, Cecily Neville, stood at the head of the House of York. He had 6 siblings: Edward, Edmund, George, Anne, Elizabeth, and Margaret. We're reimagining what these people would have looked like using modern technology and historical records. Richard spent his early childhood safely tucked away in the beautiful surroundings of Fotheringay Castle in Northamptonshire. Today, just the castle mound survives, and there's no evidence of Richard's childhood here, so I'm travelling to the Shropshire town of Ludlow. In 1459, the Wars of the Roses that had been simmering away erupted into Richard's life. He was moved from Fotheringay here to the castle at Ludlow, a much more defensible position where his father was mustering an army. It must have been quite exciting for a 7-year-old boy to be around all of that hustle and bustle of men preparing and practicing for war. But it didn't go well for the Duke of York. The Battle of Ludford Bridge would see the town of Ludlow pay a savage price. It was at Ludlow that we can see signs of Richard's long relationship with religion. He returned as a teenager to make a donation to this church. But it was his father, Richard, Duke of York, who left a physical reminder of this family's relationship with their faith. He renovated the beautiful St. Lawrence's Church, covering it with incredible insignia of the Yorkist family. Places like this were the beating hearts of the communities that they served. They catered to the spiritual needs of the people who lived around them. It's always difficult to judge medieval people's piety, how religious they were in opposition to each other, but we know religion was an important part of Richard's life, and we know too that he came here to this church. But it wasn't faith and religion that we remember Ludlow for. It's war. On the 12th of October 1459, the Battle of Ludford Bridge exploded into the streets of Ludlow. Warwick, a key ally of York's, had been meddling in the Channel, attacking and plundering boats to pay for his own army. He was called to court for his actions, and Queen Margaret of Anjou accused him and York of rebellion against the king. York marched east to try to impose himself on Henry VI. They were hoping to catch the supporters of the king by surprise. But a royal army, led by Henry, was advancing to meet them. York withdrew to Ludlow. The Yorkist forces were said to have been so threatened by King Henry's presence that when he agreed to pardon any who would change sides, part of the pro-Yorkist army defected to him. York and his key allies fled, some to Ireland, others to Calais. York's wife and their 3 young children, including Richard, sheltered in the castle as the king's men ransacked the town. His father was now a traitor against the crown. What would this have done to the young boy? Did Richard notice the way that people looked at him? Was it a little bit different? Was it hard for a 7-year-old boy to understand? A psychological assessment of Richard that was done recently suggested that he would have suffered in adulthood from a fear of uncertainty. And it's not hard to see where that would have come from with such a difficult childhood behind him. The Battle of Ludford Bridge was shortly followed by the Battle of Northampton on the 10th of July 1460. This time, leading the troops was York's eldest son, Edward. Edward and his father's ally Warwick fought against the forces of King Henry VI. It was a quick win for the Yorkists, and during the clash, Henry was captured and placed in the Tower of London. This was a key shift in power. Not only had they captured the king, but the win brought Richard, Duke of York, back from Ireland to make a shocking and ultimately successful claim to the throne of England. There are many documents that impacted young Richard's life. I've come to the National Archives to explore these with medieval curator Dr. Ewan Roger. Ewan, thank you so much for having us here at the National Archives. I can't tell you how excited I am to be close to these ancient documents. What is this and what does it say?
So this is the Act of Accord of 1460. It's essentially the Yorkist claim to the throne, seizing power and having their claim enrolled in the Parliament roll of the time. So this is the official staking of that claim.
Wow. And so how do they go through that process of establishing York's right to the throne?
This whole top section of the Act here is essentially staking that claim. It's making that family history right the way back to Henry III to say, actually, we should have been kings all along, and here's the proof.
Richard, Duke of York, shall be entitled, called, and taken from now on as true and rightful heir to the crown's royal estate, dignity, and lordship, after the death of the said King Henry. The said Duke and his heirs shall immediately succeed to the said crowns. So it's a fairly bold claim that essentially Henry VI should never have been king, it should always have been York. They're the rightful royal family. And where does it go next?
Well, the essential claim that the concord that is made is that Richard will not be king immediately, but as soon as Henry dies, Richard and his heirs will take the throne. So it essentially disinherits Henry's son from the throne.
And makes Richard, Duke of York, effectively Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne.
Yeah, exactly. And it actually states in this document, just about here, that actually, because he's now in that line of succession, it's actually now high treason, according to this document, to conspire to kill Richard or his heirs.
If any person or persons scheme or plot the death of the said Duke, that it shall be deemed and adjudged high treason. What does this mean for him in 1460?
It's really interesting because they've gone through a period of kind of real tumultuous back and forth amongst these two powerful houses. And Richard, as a young man at this time, is now put into the line of royal succession, and it's formalised, it's in the Parliament roll, it's legally binding in this case.
And this means the disinheritance of Henry VI and his dynasty. Presumably there are people who are not happy about that.
Yes, so Henry's wife, Margaret of Anjou, is clearly not going to be accepting of this. This is wiping out all the plans that they've had as a couple and with their son. There's no way realistically she can ever accept this document.
Was this ever going to work?
Frankly, no.
Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's wife, refused to accept that her son, Prince Edward, was now disinherited. She gathered an army and marched south to attack the Duke of York. They met at the grisly Battle of Wakefield. For all he'd just gained, York lost the field. He was killed along with his second son, Edmund. This was a huge pendulum swing in favour of the Lancastrians. The leader and the heir to the throne was now dead. Richard had lost a father and a brother. Richard must have been incredibly distressed by all of these losses, and here in London the fear must have been growing as the Lancastrian army moved south, creeping ever closer. London was a bustling, busy environment too. It had a population of about 50,000 people, which might not sound like a lot today, but it was 5 times the size of any other city in England at the time. For a boy who'd been brought up in a rural castle, it must have been an assault to the senses. But Richard had no time to enjoy this atmosphere. As the Lancastrian army drew closer, his mother Cecily took the heart-wrenching decision to put her 2 sons, the 7-year-old Richard and his brother George, into a small boat with a handful of servants and have them rowed away into exile in Burgundy.
A few months after Wakefield, there was a vicious bloodbath in the north of England, known as the Battle of Towton. This is often said to be the bloodiest battle in English history, with 50,000 people suggested to have taken part.
This time, the Yorkists won, led by Richard's oldest brother Edward, who was proclaimed King Edward IV. Richard and George returned from their exile as royal princes, Richard second in line to the throne behind George. But growing up in this volatile environment, Richard had also learned the cutthroat nature of medieval high society.
9-year-old Richard was now Richard, Duke of Gloucester. After the death of their father, King Edward took care of his younger siblings. Edward, meanwhile, got married to a middle-ranking heiress from Northampton, Elizabeth Woodville. More on that marriage later. Richard spent time in the care of several senior figures before making a move that would prove life-changing. He was sent north to Middleham to be trained under the watchful gaze of his cousin, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. This power base in the Yorkshire countryside became a safe haven and a home for the young Richard. This castle was 300 years old when Richard got here, and by then it was no longer just about defence. It was now a luxurious palace. It was a statement of Neville power and wealth stamped in stone. The Nevilles extended the walls and towers to reflect their growing authority, and at the centre of it all was this.
This is the Great Hall of Middleham Castle. You can tell it's the Great Hall from things like the ginormous windows behind me. And you can imagine the young Richard in a feast in this space. There's fires blazing in the hearth, the smell of roast meat, people drinking wine all around him. Middleham Castle was a great place for a young nobleman to begin his training. Richard would have undergone his academic lessons in Latin and grammar, but also the physical activities that would prepare him for a military life. A key part of martial training was hunting, and hawking was a favourite pastime.
Hawking is also known as falconry. This skill uses trained birds of prey to hunt birds and small animals for sport and food. All members of society took part in hawking, and there was a strict hierarchy of the birds you could use, from a golden eagle to a kestrel. To find out more about this fascinating sport, I'm taking flight from Middleham Castle and travelling to meet birds of prey specialist Tony Bryant. Tony has arranged for me to look at 3 of his birds: a peregrine falcon, a kestrel and a Harris hawk.
So in the medieval period, who would be flying birds?
Probably a lot more people than you'd imagine. There was a hierarchy of who could fly what. Top end of the scale was the king. The king could fly anything he wanted, but the king was the only one that flew the golden eagle and the gyrfalcon, the big white falcon of the Scandinavian countries. Other end of the scale, the knave flew the kestrel. Somewhere in the middle was the yeoman. The yeoman was basically the farming chap, and the yeoman flew the goshawk. So he was a lucky man, because the goshawk became known as the cook's bird because of its ability to catch such a wide range of prey. The goshawk would catch pheasant, partridge, duck, rabbit, and big females would even take hare. Now, the ladies flew the tiny little falcon, the merlin.
And so this is one of the few social activities that men and women often engaged in together.
Absolutely. The main hunting parties would be hunting for food, although the higher classes would hunt for sport. but they'd still eat what they caught. At the end of the day, if they'd had a good day, there'd obviously be a feast to follow.
Flying these birds might have given Richard the first glimpse of control in his life after a tumultuous upbringing full of upheaval. It's amazing how close the working relationship is between hawker and bird. But hunting and hawking were just part of a young nobleman's education, whilst at Middleham, Richard would have been educated in so much more, including social etiquette and hierarchy. This would have all been guided by the new father figure in his life, Warwick. It's hard to imagine precisely what Richard's relationship with Warwick was like. His older cousin was not only the most important nobleman in England at this time, he was also a famous soldier. He was a pirate in the Channel. He must have been a dazzling figure for Richard to be around. But whatever he thought of his cousin Warwick, there was someone else in Warwick's household that might have caught Richard's eye during this time. We know that he would meet Anne Neville here, the Kingmaker's younger daughter and Richard's future wife. But any teenage romantic dreaming would be cut horribly short. In 1470, Warwick and Richard's brother George rebelled. As part of the evolving crisis, we see Richard make a fateful enemy, perhaps the most significant of his life. Castles were a vital part of the political landscape in the 15th century. Middleham had been critical to Richard's upbringing so far, but another castle would play an important role too, Hornby Castle in Lancashire. Hornby belonged to a family called the Harringtons, but it was claimed in a legal dispute by Thomas Lord Stanley. Edward IV gave it to Lord Stanley. The Harringtons refused to leave. Stanley in 1470 had a huge cannon named Mile End dragged up from Bristol with the intention of blasting the Harringtons out of Hornby Castle. But he never fired a shot. And the reason is clear. The teenage Richard had based himself at Hornby Castle. He signs a warrant from there. He'd effectively dared Thomas Lord Stanley to fire a cannon at the king's brother, and Stanley backed down. This wouldn't be the last time that Richard would defy his brother the king, and it was the beginning of a dispute with Thomas Lord Stanley that would end in blood on a battlefield. By the time he made this stand, more conflict was on the horizon, demanding a difficult choice between the two fractious sides of his family. Richard had to pick between the man who brought him up, Warwick, and his brother George, or, on the other side, his eldest brother, the king, Edward. Richard decided to follow Edward into exile in Burgundy. Warwick restored Henry VI to the throne for 6 months before Edward, accompanied by Richard, returned. In the fog and chaos of the 14th of April 1471 at the Battle of Barnet, an 18-year-old Richard awaited his first real fight and a chance for revenge. It's hard to imagine what Richard was thinking as he tried to balance his loyalties during this period, his brother the king or his brother the rebel and the man who brought him up. Nevertheless, Richard was prepared to do his duty. He fought at Barnet. We know that he was injured there, although we don't know precisely what the injury was. Warwick was killed at Barnet too, and Richard must have felt some sort of loss for a man who had meant so much to him. And even at this young age, at 18, after his first tastes of battle, Richard just kept losing people who were important to him. Barnet may have seen the death of Warwick, but this was a clear win for the Yorkists, and it led to the next success, the Battle of Tewkesbury. This was a great victory for the Yorkists. Henry VI's only son, Edward, was killed. Queen Margaret of Anjou was captured, and on the day of the Yorkists' return to London, the death of Henry VI was announced. Lancastrian defiance had collapsed. There have been persistent rumours ever since, not helped by our friend Shakespeare, that Richard did the dirty deed himself. We don't know that Henry was definitely put to death, but all we do know for sure is that if he was, it was done on the orders of King Edward IV.
But it wasn't just in war that Richard was making his mark. There was another battle every young man sought to be engaged in: the fight for love. Richard's relationship with Anne Neville would prove astonishingly successful. Was love blossoming? That's hard to tell, but someone who knows all about the formidable Neville women is historian Joanna Lainsmith.
How does she end up being married to Richard?
Very early on, it looks like this is quite a possibility, actually, because Richard grows up for a certain part of his childhood in her father's household, and in the sort of mid-1460s. And then when her father rebels against Edward IV, she in fact marries Edward of Lancaster, completely opposing side on the Wars of the Roses. Obviously, that all falls flat when the Lancastrians are defeated. Edward IV is triumphant, and so Edward of Lancaster is killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Luckily, of course, her brother-in-law, George, Duke of Clarence, had switched sides in time to be okay with Edward IV, and so she moves into his household. And then it becomes clear that her brother-in-law, George, Duke of Clarence, really wants to acquire all her father's previous estates. Neither the king, Edward IV, nor his younger brother Richard think this is a good idea to have. So Richard is suggested as a suitable husband for Anne all over again. But we don't know when they got married. We just know that it must have happened in the early 1470s.
So it's always slightly dangerous to get ideas of talking about love and romance in a medieval marriage. But can we think about them as an effective couple in terms of the business that they do while they're in the north?
Yes, I think that would be a very fair way to look at it. Anne is really important to his position as Lord of the North because of all her connections. Her family have married into so many important people, and also have other political connections, not just marriages but also senior churchmen. So she offers him an in to this society that he's relatively new to.
And you talked a little bit about how noble women can contribute to these networks of power that are moving around in communities. I wonder if you can give us an idea of what everyday life was like for a medieval noblewoman.
One of the things that we forget easily is how much their whole day is structured around religion still. The first thing they do is they pray, they go to chapel. As they leave chapel, that's often the point at which petitioners will come and ask them either to sort out their disputes or intercede with the Lord on their behalf, or just asking for something. And they'd disperse their alms at that point, that part of the patronage and charity that noblewomen are supposed to be doing. So even before breakfast, she's doing a certain amount of business usually. Certainly if the husband was away, it would be her job to meet with the senior officers of the household. So the household is kind of 80 to 100 people at least. So these are people who need managing. If her husband was a long way away, she would also be expected to meet with his counsellors to talk about the estate management as well.
Feels to me like they did a lot more work than we ever give them credit for, and that the relationship between a nobleman and his wife was much more of a partnership than we normally think it is.
It very much depends on personalities, I suspect, but the ones that I've looked at, yes, it definitely does seem to be that way. And when you think about actually the fact that we don't know so much about Anne because most of our chroniclers and writers are writing in the south and she's spending a lot of time in the north, that's because Richard is presumably trusting her to have this responsibility in his absence.
It was in the north that Richard and Anne were fast establishing themselves as heads of an immense northern powerhouse.
In 1471, Richard becomes Lord of the North. He moves to the region and controls it on behalf of his brother, King Edward IV. It's here in the next decade that we can see Richard at work. Royal authority was being felt in the north of England as it never had before, and it was all being channeled through Richard. This was the original levelling up for the north.
It was all going so well for Richard, but things were about to get incredibly complicated. Richard was stuck in the middle of his brothers as they tore each other apart.
On the 18th of February 1478, George, Duke of Clarence, was executed by Edward. We have no real evidence for how Richard felt about this deadly rift in his family, and life for Richard and for England was about to take another unexpected turn. On the 9th of April 1483, an explosive shockwave hit England. At the age of just 40, completely unexpectedly, King Edward IV was dead. A 6'4" beast of a man, undefeated on the battlefields of the Wars of the Roses. We're told he was laid low after he caught a chill out fishing. By now, he was well known for his overeating and his womanising too, so quite what finished him off is uncertain. But one thing that we do know for sure is that England now had a new king. Edward's 12-year-old son, King Edward V. York Minster's monumental Great East Window was installed in the early 15th century. Richard, as a regular visitor to the city and the Minster, would have been aware of its majesty, but also of its content. This window tells the story of the world from the beginning of creation to the end of time. And just like the depictions in this window, for Richard, this was the beginning and the end of everything. He must have been upset by the death of his oldest brother, but also aware that power politics were now in motion, that the elites of medieval London were beginning to jostle for position and control of the new young king. There were armed men in the streets of London, ready to fight. Panic and uncertainty gripped the capital. What could be done to restore control in a spiralling situation? Step in 30-year-old Uncle Richard. Surely he would calm the chaos and look after his nephew as protector of the realm. Protector, though, was a very particular military office, and I wonder whether Edward had envisaged a wider regency under his brother while his son was too young to reign. We know that Edward makes a late addition to his will to set out his plans, but that document hasn't survived to us now. One thing that was clear, though, was that while Edward V was too young to reign, his father meant Richard to be in a position of power. Sources tell us that Richard heard of his brother's death through Edward's best friend, Lord Hastings, who warned Richard that the king's wife, Elizabeth Woodville, and her family were plotting a coup to take control of England. Richard ordered funeral masses to be said for his brother's soul here at York Minster. You can imagine the atmosphere in a packed building filled with personal grief, but also with political tensions and uncertainty. The air filled with incense as the choir's voices tried to rise up to speed King Edward's soul through purgatory. Prominent amongst the congregation, Richard was surely reflecting on the fact that he was the last of the 4 brothers of the House of York still standing. When the service was over, Richard led pledges of fealty to his nephew, the new king, causing all of the northern nobility to swear the oaths too. He then sent letters to his nephew's household at Ludlow, asking them to meet him en route to London at Northampton. Richard then prepared to leave the north, his home of more than 10 years, with the warnings of Lord Hastings still ringing in his ears. Richard arrived in Northampton, but Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, who was the young king's maternal uncle and guardian, said they'd already moved on to Stony Stratford. This was starting to sound a bit suspicious. Hadn't Hastings warned him of a coup? Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, arrived in Northampton and attached himself to Richard. Buckingham was married to a Woodville sister of the Queen and was no friend to her family. Richard had enough. By the morning, he had Earl Rivers arrested. He rode to Stony Stratford and then also arrested Sir Richard Grey, the new king's half-brother. Now, Richard sought to exert even more control over this dangerously unstable situation. The
The coronation of Edward V, planned for the 4th of May, was postponed. Instead, this was the day Richard and the young king-to-be arrived in London.
Later commentators would cynically dismiss the notion of a Woodville plot, writing it off as part of Richard's grander scheme to make himself king. I don't think that missed meeting point at Northampton should be so easily overlooked. But on the day that Richard arrived here in London, something else incredibly important happened. It needs a little bit of explanation, but it had the effect of making Richard weaker at the very moment he needed to be at his strongest. George Neville died.
As part of his legal chicanery, Edward IV divided up the Warwick inheritance between his brothers, but he also inserted a clause that they would only retain hereditary land rights for as long as the Neville family had a male heir. So, when George died, Richard had lost the power to pass on those powerful northern Neville lands to his son. It was here that we first see Richard's personal power beginning to crumble. To help unscramble this confusing situation, I'm back at the National Archives exploring the evidence with Ewan.
So the date of this document is the 20th of May, and it's summoning elections for that Parliament to be presented before the 18th of June.
So 20th of May, everything still appears as though Richard is planning to make his nephew king. He's acting in his nephew's name as protector.
Yes, and they're both kind of signing this document off. They're both, at least, as you can see from the document, they're working together.
And so when you say sign manual, that means that Edward V and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, physically wrote their names on this document. They signed these.
Yes, so you can see here R. Gloucester, and then very faint up here, R.E. for King Edward.
Incredible. So does this suggest to us that everything seems like it's going according to plan on the 20th of May? Nothing seems out of place?
On the surface, at least, it all looks to be going smoothly.
But this smooth sailing wouldn't last for long.
So as we move through our timeline of these fraught days in 1483, what is this document?
This document is a really unique, kind of on-the-ground newsletter from the time. It's one of very few bits of information we have from London in these kind of tumultuous days. And this is a newsletter written by a man called Simon Stallworth to his boss, William Stoner, who's out in Oxfordshire. And it's essentially what's happening, what's on the ground, what does his lord need to know. So there's a few kind of key bits of news that he brings out. He mentions here the Queen still being in sanctuary at Westminster.
So that's Elizabeth Woodville, still holed up at Westminster
Still
Abbey.
holed up at Westminster, yet. But he also talks about kind of daily government business going on. He talks about my Lord Protector, my Lord of Buckingham, with all the lords are kind of at Westminster in the council chamber from 10 o'clock to 2 p.m. So they're kind of there doing their work. That's all going smoothly. And one of the most interesting bits of this is it talks about the coronation plans taking place for Edward. So it's still going ahead. It's still, at least as it seems in this letter, we're still on track for a coronation.
The big question is, what is Richard up to at this stage? Is he after the throne?
There's long been a tendency to view what happened in 1483 as one long series of interconnected dots. Join them together and we see a plan to make Richard King of England. In the days after Simon Stallworth's letter, things began to move with confusing speed. On the 13th of June, Lord Hastings, that strong supporter of the young Edward V, was summoned to a council meeting here at the Tower of London. He was swiftly accused of treason by Richard, underwent a trial using the powers of the constable, was dragged outside and summarily executed.
Only 3 days later, Richard, Duke of York, the younger brother of Edward V, is sent out of sanctuary to attend his brother's coronation. But suddenly, the coronation and the opening of Parliament are postponed. Something has changed. The big question here is as simple as it is impossible to answer. We asked our historical experts what they think Richard was doing. Was he planning to make himself king?
That's when armed guards have just taken young Richard, Duke of York, out of Westminster Abbey, isn't it? I think, yes, he is by then. He's gone too far not to.
Yes. Possibly.
Yes.
Definitely.
Are all of these moments dots that we should connect together to paint us a picture of a man who is trying to make himself king? Or are they a series of isolated crises that are beginning to snowball beyond Richard's control? The only thing that we can say for certain is that things are about to get a whole lot messier. In episode 2, we investigate the chaotic days that led up to Richard becoming king. We'll see what his short reign as King Richard III can tell us about who he was and why people have turned against him. The story of Richard III is only just beginning. In episode 1, we explored Richard's life up to the summer of 1483. We left him in the midst of a growing crisis. He had arrested 2 members of the Queen's family, executed his late brother's best friend, all while supposedly looking after his nephew, the young king. The story of the princes in the Tower casts a long and dark shadow over the way we traditionally remember Richard. That's the story of Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, who were housed in the Tower of London and supposedly never seen again. We might never know the truth of how it began or ended, but we do know where the medieval gossip mill first began to turn. St Paul's Cathedral. This was the biggest meeting place in medieval London, the heart of the city, and just outside the cathedral was St Paul's Cross. This is where we see Richard's next chapter being set in stone, where he'd transform from Richard, Duke of Gloucester, to King Richard III. St Paul's Cross was a kind of medieval version of Speaker's Corner. It was a place to gather and share ideas. It was somewhere the government might float a policy to take the temperature of the city. Maybe it's the medieval equivalent of a cabinet leak today. On the 22nd of June 1483, a theologian named Ralph Shah came here and preached a sermon that would change English history forever. The explosive information that Ralph Shah revealed right here spread across London like wildfire. The sermon claimed that Edward IV had already been married to Lady Eleanor Talbot when he married Elizabeth Woodville, the mother of his children. If this was true, that meant that all of his offspring were illegitimate, including the new king. Young Edward V had no claim to the throne. But do we think what was preached on that day was true? Lots of sources will tell us that Edward IV was a well-known womanizer. He had married Elizabeth Woodville in a secret ceremony, so the question was, could he have done that more than once? What's likely to be the truth in this complex chain of events? I think there are 3 possible interpretations of the bigamy story in 1483. In version A, it's a lie concocted by Richard as a pretense to take the throne and make himself king. Option B is that this is a lie created by somebody else, perhaps someone who doesn't want a minority government or doesn't want the Woodvilles to linger around in power. They create some evidence and they sell the story to Richard, who believes it. There's always option C, that this was all true. Edward IV was legally a bigamist and all of his children were therefore illegitimate. It's impossible for us to work out which one of these stories is true. We know that an inquiry will take place in London in 1483. The evidence will be shown to the lords in London. They assess it and they decide it's true.
Later historians would write that this was a story, a lie imposed on a pliant or frightened nobility. But what might really have been going on? Few would have wanted a child king at such a turbulent time, and memories of Henry VI's problematic reign were still fresh. Perhaps Richard was just the right man for a hard job, and not the sole mastermind behind this shocking development.
Frustratingly for us, that evidence hasn't survived, so we can't see it and evaluate it for ourselves today. The only thing we do know for sure is that in 1483, the people who did see it did believe it. Edward IV was declared a bigamist. All of his children were declared illegitimate. Edward V could not and could never have taken the throne. That meant that Uncle Richard was now King Richard III.
But what do our experts think? Should Richard have accepted the bigamy argument and opened the opportunity to become king himself?
No. Why? He definitely usurped the crown. Whether that was well-intentioned or not, hard to say.
That's a tricky one. I think it's really difficult for us to see now the complexities of the toxic relationship between William Lord Hastings and the Woodvilles, and whether he really ever had any option but to make himself king.
No.
No.
Yes.
Why?
He was the most logical choice.
Richard had arrested Elizabeth Woodville's brother, Anthony Earl Rivers, along with Elizabeth's younger son from her first marriage, Sir Richard Grey, at Stony Stratford, claiming that they'd been plotting against him. They were taken north, and on the 25th of June, both were executed. Some sources have argued Richard did this to contain the powerful Woodville threat to his route to the throne. But that only works if all you can see is an ambitious monster. If Richard had evidence of a plot against him at Stony Stratford, it could be revenge. But it could be that when he threatened violence to encourage Elizabeth Woodville to cooperate and she refused, he had to make good on his threats. Another brother-in-law of Elizabeth's, the Duke of Buckingham, was also acting increasingly suspiciously. Buckingham had attached himself to Richard at Northampton and would become a chief suspect in the case of the missing princes, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. Even though they were affected by the bigamy story, his nephews remained a serious potential threat to Richard. At this stage, they would remain in the Tower of London. Did Richard murder the princes in the Tower?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Why?
Because he felt threatened and felt he had no other choice.
Not directly, but I think yes.
I think Buckingham had more to gain, and Richard must have known it would be a PR disaster. But it's clear that by the autumn of 1483, a lot of people thought they were dead, or they wouldn't have been supporting Henry Tudor from then on.
Never to be seen again? Maybe. Lots of people believe that Richard ordered the murders of his nephews, the princes in the Tower. I say that he didn't.
If we consider the evidence of Richard's actions, personality and reputation, it would be hard to see a man whose first response to a crisis would be to murder two young children, the sons of his brother. I find it hard to believe he wouldn't have tried another way. But the princes in the Tower are just part of Richard's story. By the end of 1483, Richard had something else on his mind. On the 26th of June, a delegation representing the church, the nobility and the officials of London visited Richard at his mother's home, Baynard's Castle. Richard, aged 30, the youngest brother of Edward IV, was asked to take the throne alongside his wife Anne, who would become Queen. He accepted, and his coronation date was set for the 6th of July. Preparations were made for the grandest regal occasion possible, an event designed to show everyone that Richard was now king.
This is a 17th century copy called The Little Device, which records precedents in previous coronations. So this is produced for Charles II, but it's one of the few sources of evidence we have for earlier coronations and what would have taken place at them, including Richard III's.
And how significant a moment for a monarch is their coronation?
This is a huge moment in terms of both consolidating and kind of displaying the royal power that the king has. And it's also a moment for the king and his public to kind of meet together. It's meant to be a magnificent affair. It's meant to be big. It's meant to be bold. It's meant to be a display of that power and magnificence that is invested in the person of the king.
And can we get a sense of what it was like on the day? How colourful would something like this have been?
Yeah, so throughout this account here, we have entries for bright clothing, so kind of velvet, crimson, purple cloths being used. But also we have entries for trumpets, clarions, sergeants in arms, so we can imagine this as being a very noisy space, a real kind of hit for the senses.
And do we get a sense of what Richard might have looked like on his coronation day?
So we have accounts for him, so both him and Anne. We have accounts for their clothing, so it would have been open clothing so they can be anointed, but then layered in layer upon layer of crimson and velvet. And this line particularly kind of gives us a visual of what this would have been like. So we have, and then came the king in his robes of purple velvet with a canopy borne above him. So you can really picture this and how magnificent it would have been.
How significant is it that Anne is crowned alongside Richard on the same day?
So this hadn't taken place in quite some time. Now, partly that's practical. The kind of previous kings, going back to Edward I, a lot of kings aren't married at the time of their coronations, but it's still a choice to have Anne there alongside him. And I think potentially this is a kind of the grown-ups are in the room now, and we're looking for stability. They're trying to present a stable future for the country.
In the space of a few short months, Richard had gone from Lord of the North to Protector of the Realm, and now King of England. It must have been a bewildering period for him. Whatever his real motivations during those fraught weeks in 1483, he'd now undergone an irreversible change in his life. He was the man we remember him as best, King Richard III.
But it wasn't just Richard's life that had changed. The women around him had to deal with this complex chain of events too. To dig deeper into the effect it had on his wife, Anne, I'm meeting back up with historian Joanna Lainsmith.
So what does it mean for Anne when she becomes queen? How would that change her life?
Quite a lot for Anne, because suddenly she is expected to be spending most of her time down south or in very public arenas on the progress north that they take after their coronation, that kind of thing. So she's much more in the public eye. Queens were in a very different legal situation from most married women, in that the lands they owned in their own right rather than their husband really owning them, and they were expected to administer these. There would be more pressure on thinking, well, is she going to have any more children, because kings need heirs?
Anne Neville's personality remains frustratingly shrouded from us. We might assume she was pious, mild-mannered, and good at the work her position required. But I'm not convinced by the shrinking Violet impression. This was, after all, a daughter of Warwick the Kingmaker. I think Anne knew her worth and understood her authority.
Why do we know so little about Anne Neville? She's a significant noblewoman for her entire life. She's Queen of England for 2 years, yet we know almost nothing about her.
I think partly it's because there's a large chance that some things people didn't actually want to keep from her. So if you look at the household records for a number of queens, it looks like what was going on was that people would save one household account from a previous queen as a precedent for the next. Whereas you can imagine under Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York, they didn't need Anne Neville's old house accounts, So those kinds of things would easily be lost. I wonder if there's an extent to which she was very conscious once queen that she did not want to be another Margaret of Anjou or Elizabeth Woodville in terms of all the negative publicity they got, that she would have been quite cautious in that respect.
But what of Cecily Neville, Richard's mum? What did she think of all this upheaval? After all, her grandson had just been disinherited in favour of her youngest son.
It's really difficult to try and unpick what Cecil is thinking at any point, really, because Cecily does seem to have been a really astute politician in terms of keeping in with every single regime change that goes along. And that's not just self-preservation. I mean, she's got a household and so forth, that she's got a lot of people relying on her. So you can see that she needs to look after these people and not offend each regime. So you wouldn't expect her to sort of be publicly denouncing Richard, really, because, that's not going to be good for any of the people she cares about. On the other hand, it's clear he's using her home in London, Baynard's Castle, as the base at the point in time when he takes the throne, which would be difficult, I would have thought, if she was definitely opposed to this happening.
It's another one of those frustrating sort of dead ends in the evidence here, that we can get so far, but we can't quite see exactly what's going on. Cecily isn't cutting him off. He seems to be using her London home, which might suggest there's still something going on. They're still corresponding, but we don't actually know what Cecily made of it all.
No, and I think it does look like Edward was always her favourite, from the sort of the levels of interaction that you see and the support that she gives. Obviously, it's not uncommon that you find in families that the mother will put all her emphasis on the eldest son, who is the hope of the dynasty. This is a woman in deep mourning who did not expect to lose her golden boy in this way.
Although we have no evidence of the hard power that Cecily and Anne wielded, we know they had a huge amount of soft power within the court of both Edward IV and Richard III. For Richard, it all seemed like it was going so well. He could relax, he had an heir to the throne, and the constant crises of that incendiary summer were over. But not everyone was happy with the newly established King Richard III. One woman in particular was causing friction in his court, Margaret Beaufort, and someone who knows all about her is historian Nicola Tallis. Who was Margaret Beaufort?
Margaret Beaufort was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, a son of Edward III, and so this gives her a blood link to the throne of England, but she's also a very, very wealthy and powerful landowner in the 15th century.
Not someone you want to make an enemy of.
No, not particularly, and she wasn't backwards in coming forwards either, so if she was annoyed, you tended to know about it.
Margaret Beaufort had married several times, but only had one child. She had been married at only 12 years of age to Edmund Tudor, a half-brother of King Henry VI. He died shortly afterwards, leaving Margaret widowed and pregnant. When she was just 13, she gave birth to her son, Henry, who would claim his father's title, Earl of Richmond. Young Henry would go into exile on the continent, aged 14, and Margaret's fight to bring him home became her driving aim. We know him best as Henry Tudor, the man who would become Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty.
Margaret is a staunch Lancastrian. She's born into that family, so she's always been a supporter of Henry VI. And when Edward IV becomes king, her son, Henry Tudor, is forced to flee into exile abroad. She is apart from him for nearly 15 years, actually, and she spends the entirety of Edward IV's reign trying to make attempts to bring Henry home. And she comes really, really close to doing so. In fact, she becomes so close that Edward IV drafts a pardon for Henry Tudor. But then it's almost like the very dramatic moment at the end of an episode of soap. Edward IV dies, and for Margaret, that throws Henry's fate into uncertainty.
It's one of those cliffhangers that you'd watch on a programme and think, oh, that's way too convenient. It can't possibly have happened like that. But it literally, in the moment she's about to get Henry home, Edward dies and it all falls apart for her.
In October 1483, Richard's reign faced its first major challenge, the October Rebellions. These revolts were a failed attempt to rise against Richard, led by that suspicious brother-in-law of Elizabeth Woodville's, the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham turned against Richard to launch his own bid for the crown. It failed, and he was executed for treason in November 1483. But Buckingham wasn't the only vocal opponent to Richard.
So when Richard faces rebellion, open rebellion in October 1483, what part does Margaret play in that?
Well, some sources say that she is the chief instigator in the rebellion against Richard, and I think that that's absolutely right, to be honest. I think she definitely has a grudge against him, and she does her best to rally her forces and curry support for deposing Richard.
But why did Margaret turn so openly against Richard? Was it all to do with her son, Henry, and the fateful meeting Margaret had with Richard back on the 5th of July, the day before his coronation?
Well, on the face of it, this is a business meeting, so it concerns a debt that's owed to Margaret's family in which she was seeking Richard's assistance. But I think it's impossible to imagine that Margaret didn't broach the subject of her son with Richard. And I think that this is a really, really crucial, critical point in the story, because I think it's at this point that Richard says something to Margaret that she doesn't like.
That's the day before his coronation, he has said something or done something that has made an enemy of a woman so powerful that she can and will bring Richard down. It kind of begs the question, could Richard ever have allowed Henry to come home? So could he have avoided making an enemy of Margaret? But also, was his reign doomed from the day before his coronation?
It's difficult. I don't think that there's any way he could have brought Henry home immediately. But I think that also this is quite out of character for Margaret, because we've spoken about the fact that she's very pragmatic during the reign of Edward IV. And I think the fact that she is prepared to turn against Richard so quickly is really a sign of perhaps her impatience with him. But ultimately, as you say, is there a point where he could have said, oh yes, I'll bring him home immediately, and could have avoided this? I don't think so.
But despite falling out with Margaret Beaufort, by January 1484, Richard was feeling fairly secure. He was king, his son was Prince of Wales, the October Rebellion had been crushed. The only real loose thread was the exiled Henry Tudor. Richard could now think about what kind of king he wanted to be, and there's one place we can get a glimpse of his plans. Richard summoned a parliament.
Richard III held just one parliament during his reign in 1484. It's often characterised as a desperate bid for popularity by a failing king, but I'd argue it's quite difficult to characterise it that way. What Richard does in that parliament is effectively create the presumption of innocence in English law. He passes other laws that drive out bribery and corruption in the legal system. 540 years ago, Richard creates an early form of legal aid, a way for people to bring their cases to court when they couldn't afford to do it themselves. None of those sound to me like the actions of a tyrant. If Richard was trying to favour the common man, then to draw power down to them, he needed to take it from those further up the social scale. And those were the very people who were beginning to rebel against Richard. And so I wonder whether it was Richard's interest in justice and equity for all that was the real cause of people turning against him.
One person escaped this parliament with her life when they might not have expected to. To dig deeper into this intriguing situation, I'm meeting back up with Nicola.
So following the Parliament in early 1484, Margaret Beaufort is an attainted traitor, the punishment for which is death. Why does Richard III not execute Margaret Beaufort and be done with the threat altogether?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and arguably he should have done. But I think that the answer really lays in his relationship with Thomas Stanley, Margaret's husband. And Thomas was an important figure in Richard's household and Richard's life. He's made steward of the household on 2 days before the coronation. He's very powerful in his own right. And I think ultimately Richard decides that he can't afford to risk alienating Stanley by ordering his wife's execution. So Margaret is very fortunate.
Because it would have been a novel thing to execute a woman during this period. I guess I would argue this is evidence of some mercy on his part, but I guess the counter to that is that really it's political pragmatism.
I think it is political pragmatism, most definitely, unfortunately. I think that, let's face it, Richard isn't exactly secure at this time, and I think to risk alienating one of his key supporters would have left him very vulnerable.
And so another interesting thing that happens in the immediate aftermath of that Parliament is on the 1st of March 1484, Richard III swears this oath in the centre of London, as a result of which Elizabeth Woodville from Sanctuary in Westminster sends her daughters to his court into his custody. What do you think is going on there?
Okay, so I think even removing the princes from the equation, let's not forget that Elizabeth knew full well that Richard had been responsible for issuing orders for the execution of her brother and also one of her sons from her first marriage, Richard Grey. But I think that her decision to come out of Sanctuary at this time is really driven by desperation. She's been in Sanctuary for almost a year at this point, and she still has the future of her daughters to consider, and also her remaining son from her first marriage, Thomas Grey.
If Richard murdered his nephews, the princes in the Tower, on the basis that they could be a political threat to him, if not immediately, then at least at some point in the future, it seems strange to then hand over Edward IV's oldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, who is at the centre of this plot to dethrone Richard and make her queen alongside Henry Tudor if he can become king. So if Richard is willing to kill a child who might be a threat to him one day, why would you hand over a child who is a very clear and present danger to him?
Well, I think this is why the public statement that Richard makes on the 1st of March is so important. It is made publicly at Westminster, and in this, Richard does publicly declare that he will assure the safety not only of Elizabeth, but also of her sisters if they come out of Sanctuary. And he also makes it clear that he won't imprison these girls, either in the Tower of London or elsewhere. And I think that the Tower of London is a significant point, because it shows that Elizabeth is very, very conscious of the fact that this is the last place that her sons were seen publicly alive. So I think that it makes this public statement and the swearing of it by Richard really, really important. And it's only after that is done that Elizabeth does agree to send her daughters out of Sanctuary.
But this wasn't all that Richard had to worry about. He was about to lose the two most precious people in his life. In April 1484, Richard's son, Edward, died around 8 years of age. The cause of his death remains unclear.
Aside from the obvious personal distress that this must have caused for Richard and Anne, it had dire political consequences. Edward had been Richard's only legitimate son, his only heir to the throne. The foundations of Richard's rule were beginning to crumble beneath him, and less than a year later, on the 16th of March 1485, his wife of more than 10 years, Anne, also died. Richard had seen the deaths of parents, siblings, mentors, friends, now his wife and the beloved son that they shared. He must have felt like accepting the crown had come at a terrible cost.
For Richard, it might feel like he had nothing left to lose. It's hard to get into Richard's mindset at this moment. Would he have felt like he'd lost everything, or that the only thing that would have kept him going was his duty to the crown? I'm heading to Bosworth to explore his final months and how one man had a huge role to play in his downfall: Henry Tudor. To uncover more about him, I'm meeting historian Nathan Amin.
So Nathan, who on earth is this guy Henry Tudor?
So Henry Tudor is a minor Welsh noble, born in Pembroke in 1457. He is of Welsh, English and French extraction. But the truth is, he was born figuratively and literally far from any throne. He was descended on both sides of his family tree from the reigning House of Lancaster, but his birth went, unnoticed during his day.
And how does Richard go about countering this new threat?
Well, first of all, he tries to have Henry attainted in Parliament. He calls him the King's great rebel and traitor. He tries to break this potential marriage union between Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York by having Elizabeth, married into the Portuguese royal family.
Not by marrying her himself.
There's no evidence that he was planning to marry her himself. And what he also tries to do is he tries to engage in a propaganda war with Henry Tudor.
So I've managed to bring one of the proclamations that Richard makes against Henry, and this one, if you'd like to hold the Richard III Society bookmark for me, that would be great.
Proudly.
This is from December 1484, so by this point Henry is a threat to Richard, and I think in some of this language we can see how seriously Richard is now taking that threat. He talks about all of the rebels who have forsaken their natural country, and then he says that they've taken as their captain one Henry, late calling himself Earl of Richmond, which of his ambitious and insatiable covetous, stirred and excited by the confederates of the king and the said rebels, encroacheth upon him the name and title of the royal estate of the realm of England. And then he talks over here about their intention to do the most cruel murders, slaughters, robberies. I mean, we often talk about Richard being blackened by Tudor propaganda, but this is very clearly Ricardian propaganda against Henry.
Well, what he's got to do, Richard, here, is salvage his own reputation. This is Ricardian propaganda that is designed to try and win the hearts and minds of the English people. Time would tell whether that would work.
And we do see it ramping up, because later on Richard will issue another proclamation in which he's, by this point, questioning Henry's parentage.
He does, yeah. So in June, so just a couple of months before the Battle of Bosworth, that would culminate in this clash between these two men, he reissues this proclamation, but he adds some slander of the Tudor family background. He, in effect, has a pop at Henry's Welsh lineage. He's also once more centering himself as a true English king who should be the leader of the English people. It's pure propaganda.
All of these emerging problems demonstrate, for me, a political naivety in Richard. For some reason, he's struggling to take all of England with him. I think we can find some compelling evidence for why Richard was failing to convince key portions of English society of his rule, and it has nothing to do with his two nephews.
Rumours were circulating about the fate of the princes in the tower. People speculated that perhaps Richard may have had something to do with their disappearance, or perhaps these were just rumours. Either way, just when Richard thought things couldn't get any worse, he was forced to face his biggest challenge. On the 7th of August 1485, backed by the French crown, Henry Tudor landed in Wales, moved up the west coast, and then turned inland to Shrewsbury, where he was welcomed by his allies. Richard began to gather his army at Leicester, but was forced by Henry's speed to meet his rival in battle, meaning large chunks of his army never arrived here at Bosworth on the 22nd of August 1485. Henry had been exiled for 14 years. He had no prospects, and his chances of success were virtually non-existent. But battlefields are notoriously unpredictable places. Someone who has extensively surveyed Bosworth battlefield is Richard Mackinder.
Who picks this spot for the Battle of Bosworth?
Richard III, undoubtedly. He picks it because it's topographically a useful position to be. It's the top of a ridge. He's come from Leicester, he's walked along the main road, marched in, and he's on that ridge looking out towards where he knows his main enemy is.
And from here, where is Henry Tudor?
We're not 100% certain of Henry's campsite, but best evidence so far states he's out towards Sheepheap, which is about 3, maybe 4 miles in that westerly direction.
And from here too, do we know where the Stanley army is?
Well, that's the big fun of this battle, is the fact we had 3 armies, none of which were definitely on 2 sides. So we had that third option. And as far as we are led to believe from archaeological evidence and from the early chronicles, he was out on our left-hand side over the brow of the hill, again, probably out of sight, but the scouts would have known. Scouts would have been running around from all sides. Everybody would have known where everybody was to a greater extent.
The third army we have was the Stanley army. Now, Stanley is a name we've heard a few times. Thomas Stanley wasn't just the husband of Margaret Beaufort, so stepfather to Henry Tudor, but also the same Stanley that Richard had defied at Hornby Castle, aged 18 in 1470. Thomas Stanley had sat on the fence to keep himself safe throughout the drama of the Wars of the Roses. So as the armies took to the field at Bosworth, Stanley loyalty was unclear. Whose side would they take?
If you were a betting man on that morning, who are you putting your money on?
Just by sheer numbers, Richard.
The scene was set for a battle that would change the course of English history. Richard is taking me to a privately owned location where we're getting unique access to where Richard is believed to have made his final stand.
This is the centre of the known battlefield. And I say known because we're still doing research on it, but we know that crucial things took place in this area. We've got Stanley probably somewhere off to my left.
Stanley and his army were positioned midway between Richard and Henry. That can only have been so that they could hedge their bets, make sure they intervened on the winning side and protect themselves. Richard had some experience of war, though his last battle had been 14 years earlier at Tewkesbury. He had reportedly been excited at news of Tudor's arrival. It was his chance to put down a final revolt. Winning today would make him the unrivaled king. For Henry, this would be a first taste of battle that no amount of training could prepare him for fully. The choice was stark. Either Richard had to kill Henry, or Henry would kill him. Only one man would leave the field, and he would leave it wearing the crown of England. The initial clashes were inconclusive. In the thick chaos of battle, Richard saw a chance to charge at Henry himself, exposing a weakness in his left flank. This was a weakness that the Stanleys would exploit, finally revealing their hand.
I think Richard was slightly behind you, coming down the line of the Roman road before engaging Henry. But he's seen by Stanley, who comes in from behind Henry, clashes with Richard and drives him back to this area, to the marsh, which is what we're told by Shakespeare and all the chroniclers. Richard is then left fighting, we're told on foot, for his life. And this is that area in which that final part of the battle took place.
This was where Richard launched a thunderous cavalry charge directly towards Henry, and where he fought on foot, surrounded by his enemies, until he was beaten to the ground and killed.
He's the last king of England ever to die in battle. It's odd how being in this landscape can connect you to that history, to all of the men who lost their lives that day, and amongst them, the fallen King Richard. In the aftermath of the fighting, his body would be stripped and mutilated, just as his reputation would be in the years and centuries that followed.
Shakespeare portrayed him as a bitter tyrant, a bottled spider. Historians lauded the Tudors whilst damning Richard. It wasn't until the 20th century that people started to seriously reappraise Richard and his brief reign. So, Richard III, good guy or bad guy?
All right, guy.
A man of his time.
Good.
Why?
Because he was no worse than anybody else.
Neither.
And why?
Because he's been dead for 500 years and I don't know him.
Good guy gone bad.
Why?
Because his life and his times, he does appear to have had some good integrity, but at the end, he saw the throne, he went for it.
It's an unfair question, really. It's the shades of grey in Richard's story that are the most interesting to me. As a child, he dealt with the kind of trauma that might have seen him in therapy today. He'd become aware at a young age of just how fragile security could be. As an adult, he tried to build a life for himself and his family in the north of England, but 1483 had seen all of that turned upside down.
He was a man who struggled against insecurity, living in turbulent times, unsure who he could trust, threatened on all sides.
This is a man who showed an interest in fairness, but who we're also told ordered the murders of his two young nephews. How can we reconcile those stories? Perhaps they're two sides of the same coin. One is rumour, one is truth. But how do we tell them apart? What should we believe about King Richard III?
Thanks again to Incogni for sponsoring this video. Click on the link in the description to find out how you can take your personal data back.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.